Hello, everybody, and I'm delighted this afternoon to be talking to Erica San. Erica is currently a solicitor at Bhatt Murphy, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. But before that, Erica was a law graduate at Cambridge and then did an LLM at UCL, and she'll talk a bit about that, I'm sure, and then the LPC at Uni of Law. Um, so just to start, thanks hugely for doing this, Erica. It's been on my list of things to catch up with you for ages, so I'm grateful that you managed to find some time to do this. Why don't we just start with the nature of the work you do know? And I think it's quite recently that you actually fully qualified as a solicitor at Bhatt Murphy. So you can maybe talk a bit about being a trainee there as well as being a fully qualified.
Cool. So yeah, I've just qualified into the police law team. So a lot of my work are claims against the police arising from unlawful stops and search, unlawful arrests, use of force, and things like that. And then another big part of my practice are cases arising from deaths in custody. The majority of the inquest work that I do are women who have passed away while they are in prison. And that's kind of a new aspect of my practice. I think when I first started as a trainee, a lot of my work was on the police law side of things and also mental health deaths, deaths arising from mental health detention. And in my second year, I also did a seat, I guess they call it, in immigration detention and claims arising out of that, and also a couple of public law bits here and there. And I think the biggest difference being a trainee and qualifying is that as a trainee, we have broad seats, but you are kind of driven by what the partner that you're working with or the solicitor that you're working with is interested in. So you never quite know what you're going to get when you first start. And I think that's great when you're first starting out and you're trying to figure out what you want to do. But on qualification, you do get the opportunity to develop your own practice and express an interest in things that you want to explore further. So I guess that's the biggest difference.
Well, that's great. I mean, I have to say, listening to you, there are going to be some very obvious insights you can offer around things like skills and strengths, and also perhaps just comment on the emotional resilience that's required there. Some of that sounds as though it might be quite harrowing.
Yeah, it's quite difficult work actually, and I think vicarious trauma in the profession is something that's being talked about loads recently. Actually, I think the Legal Action Group recently released a book about this and ways that practitioners can cope. At Bhatt Murphy, we're quite lucky because we actually have this guy who I think is a psychologist, but he does sessions with the different groups in the firm, so like trainees and solicitors and partners about how to, well, there are two aspects of it, how to protect yourself from getting vicariously traumatized through these cases, and secondly, how to protect your clients. Because, for example, when you're taking a witness statement from a client, you have to kind of take them back through quite difficult topics, and it's all about how to make sure that we're doing that in a productive way that's not re-traumatizing for them. There are quite a lot of resources out there, but I think the main tip is just to remember that it's okay to take a break and just to talk to people. Like, having a support network is really important to be able to
Mm.
do this kind of work, and it is difficult, but
Mm.
it's very rewarding.
That yes, that's well, and you can talk a little bit more about the rewards now if you like. But I know you did, as many law students do, a VAC scheme with a Magic Circle law firm.
Mhm.
Um, just just looking at that level, just how different are the skills and the strengths you would have had insights to into the commercial practice compared to your practice now. You've talked about some of the strengths, but some of those additional skills that you need to develop.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because, well, my experience at during my vacation scheme was, I think if I remember correctly, I think I was in equity capital markets, which I didn't even know what that was when I started. But just the nature of commercial work, you're normally working with professional clients. There are quite a lot of people in your team. So and the work that you're doing is more, I guess, by nature, like about business and corporations and stuff, rather than like people and things that have happened to people. Whereas with my work, it's normally just me and a partner, or just if once you're more senior, normally yourself or a trainee, or some people are just by themselves. So you kind of get quite isolated. But then the other side of that is that there is a lot of client contact, and that client contact is quite personal. It's not just review this contract. You do have to like get to know people quite well, and I think having the skill to talk to lots of strangers about quite intimate things about their life is an interesting one, and very difficult to develop when you're a student. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating, and we could talk about this throughout the whole of the recording, really. But I'll restrict myself to one more question, which is something around intersectionality. In other words, when you're solving the legal problem in front of you, you might also perhaps be solving 4 or 5 other issues for your client on which they're not particularly strictly legal, but they're just part of the holistic solution. Is that true or not?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think we are so guided by, what is it that our client wants, right? And so most of our cases are civil claims for compensation. But for a lot of people, it's not about the money. For if you've had a loved one die in police custody, no amount of money is really going to make that right. So what we would try to assist with alongside the civil claim, and they can kind of work together, is help with police complaints, things like that. And with a police complaint, the difference is that you can actually have personal accountability from the officers involved, for example, which is something that you wouldn't be able to achieve from a civil claim. But also some families just aren't interested in that. If they're so disillusioned with the whole process, it's so difficult, to have, a misconduct finding against an officer, for example, that it wouldn't be something that they want to engage with. So it is and also it changes, you might be interested in that at the beginning, but afterwards, you wouldn't want to proceed with it. So it's just it's a constant conversation with the clients. And like we, I guess, have a range of tools that we can use, and not all of them are always appropriate depending on what the client is actually looking for.
That's interesting. Let's move on and just talk about, we've already highlighted the fact that at one point you were on one level looking at the corporate world, and yet you ended up in something that is so different. Could you just sort of highlight for the listeners the sort of activity profile you had when you were making that transition, and particularly the sort of things that impressed an audience that was assessing you, whether it was Bhatt Murphy or another law firm? What were the sort of things they're on your LinkedIn profile, but what sort of things stood you in good stead?
Just to start, I just wanted to say that I think I don't think I ever had a genuine interest in commercial law, and I think a lot of people do, and I think that's cool. I don't understand it, but it's cool. But I think for me, it was just the only way I could fund my LPC, which is, maybe we can touch on that later, but it really isn't. So if you don't want to do it, you definitely don't have to. But in terms of what impressed my employer, I am not sure. I think like I did quite a few different things, and I think for me personally, the most useful experience I had was when I was volunteering at the Haringey Migrant Support Centre. They're quite a small charity, and what I helped with was taking a lot of new inquiries and figuring out whether it's something that the charity could assist with, and if so, how, and if not, where do we signpost them to. And that was really useful for me, because you had to kind of identify issues really quickly, learn how to talk to people who are very distressed, how to be efficient but also compassionate. And it's a really tricky skill, especially if, like, I think growing up in my generation, we hate picking up the phone. Like, it's just, we want to do a text or an email, but that just doesn't work for a lot of people. So getting used to that is really, yeah, is a challenge. And I think it doesn't really matter what specific experience you have when you're applying for jobs at like a legal aid firm like mine, just because there's not that many opportunities for paid work experience. So everyone just comes in with, whatever they've managed to do. And it's about demonstrating what you've gotten out of that rather than the specific, oh, I've
That's
done this,
That's great. That's great advice. Making the most of what you have got is really such good advice on any application level, and particularly to hear you say that of this particular environment. Just on the Haringey Law Centre, did you just, on a practical level, were you approaching more than one law centre? Did you walk in off the street? Just how hard was it to get into that law centre as a volunteer?
So I was quite lucky because I actually managed to get that through the UCL Careers Pro Bono Centre, and they have a lot of links with a lot of organisations. But during that time, I think I sent about 10 applications through UCL, but I think because the pool was a little bit smaller than the
Yeah,
general public, it was slightly easier to get my foot in the door. But
right,
beyond that, I did send a lot of volunteering applications to places like Stopwatch, Release, and I didn't get a response from any of those.
right.
But I think the difficulty was that I was applying during COVID, where,
Yeah.
I think a lot of these charities were really stretched. So it might be different today.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, you always have to appreciate just how different the landscape was then.
Oh,
You mentioned UCL because that's where you did your LLM. What about the LLM being impressive? Because you did take a dissertation topic that was relevant, I think, and
good
and
memory.
and so on. So did that make a material difference, do you think? And should students consider doing that?
I think so. So I remember when I was applying for the LLM, it was kind of like oh, I don't know what I'm doing. Let's just have a look at, all of my options and just send stuff out everywhere and see what happens. But I think what made me eventually decide to go with UCL in the end was that at where I was when I graduated, I wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to do. I knew it was human rights law. I knew, something domestic, something for social good, but I wasn't quite sure what I meant by that. I think I still had, some thoughts about family law, for example. And I thought that doing an LLM where I was able to kind of dive in a little bit more detail about specific areas that I was interested in would allow me to kind of narrow down what I wanted to do. So I took criminal justice and human rights, I think it's called. And that kind of gave me an insight into some of the issues. So we did a couple of modules on stop and search. And I did a little bit of reading around, looked at, what firms are working in this area. And that kind of got me to the practice area of actions against the police, which I hadn't considered while I was an undergraduate. So maybe it's not on LLM specifically that was helpful, but I think just giving myself a bit of time
Mm.
to figure out what I wanted to do before starting my career was really helpful for me.
No, that's great, great insights again. So thanks for that. What about, it doesn't have to be particular to Bhatt Murphy, but generally the legal aid law firms where you're trying to break into either as a trainee or as a paralegal or indeed subsequently if you're applying in any sense. How different is that to a commercial law firm's practice? Because they multi-layer the assessments in terms of what they put students through. How different is it in what's the process like in this world?
Mm. It varies a lot firm to firm. So with commercial firms, I think I remember there was like one kind of portal that you could sign in and drop in all of your information. And you could just use that with a lot of firms. But with legal aid firms, I think the process is just, it's so varied. But I guess the similar themes are they're interested in why you want to do this rather than your specific experience and like what it is about you as a person that would make you right for this job. I would say as well that a difference between legal aid work and commercial work is that the time to get a training contract is just so different. And if you're looking for this as a career, then, you know, don't compare yourself to, you know, the people who have gotten a training contract in their first year, because it just doesn't happen. I think most of the trainees at my firm have been either paralegaling for at least 5 years or having done another career before that. A lot of people have to paralegal for a while before they get a training contract. So I don't think there's anything wrong with applying for, you know, legal assistant roles, paralegal roles, even receptionist roles at law firms is a big way that a lot of people get their foot in the door. So yeah, it is just a super different process on the timeline. You just can't really compare it. But then I think on the flip side, the responsibility that you get as a trainee is so much more than maybe a commercial firm, from what I've
Oh, absolutely, unquestionably. Just what was I going to say? Oh, so when you come to that sort of the heart of the process that's going to result in them engaging with you and offering you, is it really just interview based? There's no are there tests? Are there written case studies? Do they put you through anything other than the interviews? And if it's just the interviews, what are they like?
Yeah, I think so. For Bhatt Murphy, I think I did 2 interviews, and I think both of those were accompanied with a written test that you did kind of now before your interview or something like that. And the written tests were things like drafting an advice letter to a client, or like reading a case and summarizing that. So nothing too academically strenuous. I don't think they expect a lot of technical knowledge from you, but it's just about whether you get, you know, how to talk to clients and whether you're a person, like a real human. And in terms of the interview, I did a couple of interviews at various firms, and they were all quite different. But I think the common theme was that it was really helpful if you were able to demonstrate knowledge about the cases that the firms have done, rather than just generic interest. You know, being able to, if you know who your interviewers are beforehand, like Googling them and reading their most recent cases are it will probably come up. And if not, then you can probably squeeze it in as a way to show off.
Okay. And they're not too worried about that sort of approach, because some lawyers don't like the show off or the ingratiating approach. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but they're okay with that, are they?
I guess it depends on like whether or not you've actually engaged with what you've read. If you're just kind of name dropping without
Yeah.
being able to talk about it, I think it's just all about whether you're genuine and if you're actually interested. Because I think if you are really keen, you probably would have Googled these people, and I don't think there's any shame in that. I think that's
Okay.
fine.
All right. That's great.
Yeah, but as long as you're genuine.
And just while you've led us down this pathway, anything that you now think you wish you had done that you didn't do in your own particular situation, or any new resources that you think would be useful for students to be aware of?
I think reading reports by charities or organizations that work in like adjacent areas would be really helpful, like just contextual understanding of the field that you're working in. So for example, I do a lot of inquest work, but I've never engaged with the charity Inquest, who produce a lot of really interesting and useful reports.
Right.
That I think if I had read that beforehand, I'd be like, oh, I'd be in a great position
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to a couple of other topics, Erica. Um, I did want your view on the diversity initiatives you see within the legal profession now. They're quite profound, they're quite widespread, they've been going on for a while. And yet students, I think, still wonder how best to orientate themselves with that whilst they are at Cambridge and what that might mean for them. What advice would you give about engaging with the legal landscape and recruiters who are soliciting applications in a diversity and inclusivity context?
Mm. I think it's an interesting problem, and I think from what I remember during about my time as an undergraduate, I think you, it's quite daunting to sign up for yet another um thing because it feels like it could be a time commitment. But I think what really worked for me was trying to just engage with as many different organizations as possible. So for example, recruitment, aspiring solicitors, Upreach, and just figure out what works for you. And I think these organizations change so much. And I think a lot depends on, for example, what case worker you're allocated to. So I signed up to, when I signed up to aspiring solicitors and it was quite difficult to match me with anyone because I had asked for a non-commercial legal aid firm, and they were really helpful. They still offered to look at my applications and my CV and things like that, but they said that unfortunately they couldn't really give me any specific advice. With Upreach, it was similar. I was put in like the charity and third sector group, and it was the same. There wasn't any specific employer they could match me with or things like that, but they were also they were still able to do like interview prep with me, coaching, and
Right.
stuff like that. So it's the, even if it's not specifically or like exactly tailored to what you need, I think if you've thought about what you want, or you're open to having that conversation with someone, I think you can really make the most out of these resources, which are like there for you and so helpful.
That's good. Making the most has come up as a theme again. And I think that's not trivial. It's the sense that I think sometimes students feel there's an ideal or a perfect answer or the right way of doing these things. And I think what you're saying is, in reality, it's about the advocacy you build around making the most of what you've got yourself that impresses.
Yeah, and it's such a good way of learning about yourself as well, because I think it would be like dishonest to say that I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I started in my first year, right? Like it is just a process, and what was right for me then back in 2017 isn't necessarily what's going to work for me now. So
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a great way to bring us up to the sort of rounding off final question, if I may. And it's just simply to throw it over to you and say, is there a final piece of advice that you would offer the listeners or an insight that you've thought of as we've been talking that hasn't come up? What are your final thoughts?
hmm, I think my final piece of advice is that like take your time, you know. You're
Mm.
young, there's no need to stress about this. Like I think I really put a lot of pressure on myself, especially in like the second or the first term of my final year. I was like, why haven't I got it sorted out now? Why do I not know what I'm doing the next year? And like just taking time and letting things fall into place is just, it sometimes that helps, you know, just not rushing into anything and just really trying to think things through.
That's really great. A great position to end it, Erica. Thanks very much for spending the time with us today.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.